Hey everybody, my name is Chris. I'm a member of the BOSH team currently for about 3 years. I've worked on Cloud Foundry for, I don't know, like 10 years or something like that, or been a consumer of it or whatever. I think the first time I did a CF push, it wasn't even CF push yet, it was VMC push way back when. In terms of BOSH, BOSH is also old, complicated, interdependent, and scary, but you can still add features. I looked up the... Well, authoring a BOSH release may be easy. Maintaining and extending BOSH, maybe not so easy. I look back and like the first director commit on GitHub was like in 2010, so like it's incredibly old, and it might have existed before that in a different source code format. But all these features I'm going to talk about have landed in the last like year or so. And after this talk, I hope you feel inspiration and feel empowered to teach your old enterprise software new tricks as well. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is some of the new capabilities you have in connecting to your director directly from the BOSH CLI. So like, are you tired of putting your own SSH key on the BOSH director? Like, you don't need to do that anymore. The BOSH director, since it's deployed by BOSH, is running a BOSH agent on it. And that's like a little agent that goes and does anything it wants to do on the VM. And commonly in like most BOSH deployed VMs, there's like a NATS bus, and the director publishes something, and the agents do what it says. But there's also an HTTP endpoint. And this is how you're able to deploy BOSH with BOSH, because when you do BOSH create env. So there's a couple things you need. You need to know like, where is that agent endpoint? And I've given you an interpolation path here from your BOSH manifest, and also a certificate. And now you can do BOSH logs -- director, and this also applies to SSH. So you can SSH right to your BOSH director, and also SCP things. And it's basically the same process as when you SSH to a regularly deployed BOSH VM, where we create a temporary SSH user. Maybe you're bundling up logs, your SCP things. Then when you log off, the SSH user is gone. It gets deleted. And as I said, like the big difference here is that you're not talking over the NATS bus. You're talking directly to the agent via the CLI and the HTTP interface. You'll notice it doesn't say downloading director logs, because it actually applies to anything you use create env for. Director is probably the most common thing, but you might have a concourse worker you could use this with. All right. Next, we have BOSH create recovery plan and BOSH recover. This kind of came from some feedback from some customers where like they had some outages where, let's say, their storage fell over or something like that, and they have, I don't know, 300 Diego cells or something, and like half of them are not running. And they could do BOSH TCK, but that's a really interactive process, and you have to sit there and click like, yes, I want this resolution for this or that, and it takes a long time. So this was designed to make it faster to get you to a sort of stable state. So the key insight here, when you do BOSH create recovery plan and you give it a YAML file to write to, it'll take you through sort of the same interface as BOSH Cloud Check, except there are a couple of differences where we found out like for each instance group, you want to have kind of the same resolution. Like for your Diego VMs, you probably like if there's something wrong with them, you can just recreate them, no big deal, right? But for like your MySQL VMs, you probably want to do something a little bit more delicate. They don't want to interactively change it or select it for every VM, so we said, okay, for all of the instance types, you can just do one sort of plan for each instance type. And the other thing was max and flight, where often people have pretty conservative max and flights, but in like a disaster recovery scenario, you're not necessarily thinking about like, how do I keep every availability up, because that's already gone. We just want to get back to having all the VMs in a state that they're trying to recover as fast as possible. So here, say, there's some ellipses here aligning it, but basically we came back with a couple different Diego cells that were like, hey, some were missing VMs, and we chose, hey, let's recreate those ones that are missing VMs. And some have unresponsive agents, so we can reboot them. And then maybe our max in flight was like 1, but we're like, hey, let's do 3. So then the sort of companion command here is BOSH recover, which takes that YAML file and goes ahead and just kind of gives you a little review of what it's going to do. It says like, hey, here's what I'm going to do with these Diego cells. And you go, yes, and it just goes and does it. You don't have to sit there and click yes a bunch of times or anything. And you can just repeatedly do this over and over. And it's sort of particularly useful for like service broker, service instance deployments, where they're all kind of self-similar in terms of like instance groups. So you could create one recovery plan. You could have this in a runbook. And if you had an outage of a bunch of service instances, you can just continually run this on all those different deployments. And behind this, there's basically all the same stuff that BOSH Cloud Check has. The same the same problems it has, the same resolutions. So it's all kind of well understood from that point. The next one's kind of interesting. I can't give you just like a little CLI command here, but there's a new update strategy for variables in BOSH manifest. So kind of the motivation here is to be able to roll out certificate updates that affect every VM in like a non-surprising way. So if you look at, for example, like the BOSH DNS certificate, that's something that's on every VM. So if you were to rotate that and then do a deploy, it wouldn't look like the deploy was really doing much, but in fact, it's going to end up touching every VM. So the kind of the insight we had there was like one thing we know that is going to touch every VM is if you're deploying a stem cell update. So if we could bundle together things that touch every VM with things that we already know, then we could have operators not be surprised by the fact that there's like a long deploy just because you like rotated a certificate. A little bit of background here. So BOSH stores the version of every variable for a given deploy from the config server, which is generally CredHub. You can run BOSH variables and see this. It'll tell you, here's all the variables in my manifest, and here's the version that I'm going to ask for from the config server. And with the default strategy, which is on deploy, basically when you generate a manifest and you do BOSH deploy, it's going to be like, hey, for this, slash BOSH DNS, TLSCA, or whatever it is, CredHub, can you give me the latest version of that? Because I'm going to deploy that. So with our new update strategy on stem cell change, it doesn't do that. It goes, okay, for the variables that have this update strategy, it's not going to ask the config server or CredHub for a new version. It's going to say, I'm going to use the same version as the last deployment, basically, unless that deployment also includes a stem cell change. And also, you can override this if you need to with a flag in either the director or the CLI called force latest variables if you absolutely need to deploy a new version, say your certificate has expired or something like that. And what I think is the most sort of interesting thing about this feature is that it really required us to like invalidate like a fundamental assumption of the BOSH director, which is like, hey, I'm going to get the latest version of every variable every time, and that's just been there for time immemorial. And kind of another note about that is like figuring out if a stem cell change was actually quite tricky. It was an interesting problem. So yeah, that's my little lightning talk there. Thanks to the BOSH team, past, present, and future. If anyone else wants to contribute, that's great. Thanks to Amelia for the encouragement to submit a CFP. And I've left some reference here. There's one bonus one with the BOSH Agent compile stuff I didn't have time to do, but that's my talk.